resistance to dire prediction is very human, and we can certainly see it today. I mean, if we're faced with some very heavy, ominous prediction, things you never saw happen are going to happen, and it's going to be expensive to mitigate it, we have a natural tendency to reject or ignore the prophecy. And after all, there are no prophets, not even the scientific community, who are right all the time. And you can find competent scientists who have made predictions, supersonic transports will destroy the ozone layer, for example, that are just wrong. And so it's very easy to dismiss. Also, if the factors precipitating the anticipated catastrophe are long-standing, then the prediction is a kind of rebuke to us. How did we permit this peril to develop? Why didn't we see it beforehand? Why didn't we take political steps to prevent it? So these are uncomfortable ruminations that through our own inattention or inaction, some catastrophe is coming. Put it out of our mind. So this, or find a reason to reject it. This temptation to minimize, to dismiss, is something that psychiatrists know very well about. They have a technical name for it. It's called denial. Denial. The rock group Dire Straits, I'm sure many of you know their repertoire, has a line in one of their songs which goes, "Denial ain't just a river in Egypt." So these two cases, I claim, are the opposite poles of policy response to predictions of disaster. Croesus, representing the pole of sort of credulous, uncritical acceptance propelled a little bit by greed or other character flaws, and Cassandra, representing, the response to her, representing the pole of stolid, immobile rejection of the possibility of danger. Well, today we have a set of such prophecies. And for all the average person understands, they could just as well have emanated from the Delphic oracle for all the fundamental understanding of the underpinnings there is. So it gets to be a kind of challenge, a battle between two arguments from authority. There's one bunch, they're sort of nice looking, they say it's worrisome. There's this other bunch, they're sort of nice looking, they say it's not worrisome. What'll I choose? Well, I'll choose the one that's most comfortable. I think we are much closer to the danger of Cassandra than of the danger of Croesus. Now, let me give a very brief statement of why I take greenhouse warming so seriously. Those of you who have attended the sessions this morning, this afternoon, have heard a much more detailed expert summary of these reasons. First of all, there is no question that such a thing as a greenhouse effect exists. I talked about Venus. This benign planet, looking exactly as it does here, but with no greenhouse effect, would be 20 degrees centigrade, that's what, 36 Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of water. With no greenhouse effect, this planet would be frozen, solid. The oceans would be 3 kilometers of ice. A little greenhouse effect is a good thing. We owe our lives to the greenhouse effect. No greenhouse effect, we would never have come into being. The principal greenhouse gases are water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, there are some minor constituents, methane, oxides of nitrogen, and chlorofluorocarbons, which go by the brand name freons. And they are an especially interesting aspect of this because they are wholly man-made. You see, astronauts, many of them, in Earth orbit, seeing to the naked, unaided eye this beautiful vista, can make out, as perhaps is hard to do in this picture, the very thin blue aura that surrounds the bright hemisphere, the illuminated hemisphere of the Earth. And that's just the thin atmosphere seen edge on. This phrase, the ocean of air, is a kind of misnomer. Ocean suggests massive, impervious. But instead, that thin line that you can barely make out in this picture is very fragile, vulnerable to the depredations of human beings. Our technology and our numbers have both reached a state where inadvertently we can pose a danger to the global environment, especially through the atmosphere. The abundance of greenhouse gases is increasing. Greenhouse gases act as a kind of blanket holding the heat in. There is no question that all of the gases I just mentioned are steadily increasing in abundance. In addition, it seems very clear that the average temperature of the Earth has been increasing through the 20th century. It's a noisy record. There are hot years and cold years always, so the curve of temperature versus time has a jagged aspect to it, but the slow increase with time is becoming increasingly clear, and one indication of that is that the 5 hottest years of the 20th century were in the decade of the 1980s. That is also the decade which had the highest abundance of all of those greenhouse gases. In addition, there is most interesting evidence from an Antarctic ice core taken by a Soviet team in which the past temperature history of the Earth for tens of thousands of years and the past abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can both be measured. There are little bubbles of air that are trapped in the ice, laminated between successive snowfalls. And we find that when the carbon dioxide is higher, the temperatures are higher. When the carbon dioxide is lower, the temperatures are lower. There is a virtually one-to-one correlation. Now, nobody pretends we understand everything about the global climate. There are feedbacks, some of which you warm the Earth a little bit, and the tendency will be to further increase the temperature, so-called positive feedback. And others in which you warm the Earth a little, and the situation is self-correcting, like a thermostat, and it cools the Earth a little. And there is a push and pull, a tug, between these competing feedbacks. Doubtless, we have not identified all of them. The present consensus, I believe, is that the bad kind of feedback, the ones that make things worse, the so-called positive feedbacks, dominate. I would think it would be an astonishing coincidence if the balance of all these feedbacks just exactly corrected the problem that we are generating through human technology, a kind of deus ex machina, to go back to the Greek analogies. You know, in the Greek plays, when the playwright got himself into a plot pickle and couldn't figure out how to resolve it, then there was an actor on wires representing a god who flew into the set and put everything right. It was called Deus Ex Machina, the god of the machine, from the machine being the device that plopped him down on the stage. It's asking a lot to believe that the problem is going to fix itself. If we look at the prognostications, the three-dimensional general circulation computer models, of which there are some 6 independent models working right now, mainly in the United States, one in UK, they all predict temperature increases of a few degrees centigrade between now and the middle of the next century. And the difference between them is only a factor of 2 in temperature rise. None of the models predict that the Earth's climate's going to get cooler. None of them predict it's going to be tens or hundreds of degrees increase. The agreement, considering the state of our knowledge, is quite good. If you then look at the output of these computer models, which purport to give a sense of how the temperatures change on a regional basis as you go through time, you begin to see some very worrisome things. Yes, there are some places that get cooler and some places they get warmer, but the overall trend is warmer. And by the middle of the 21st century, there's no winner. Every place has gotten warmer. And to give you an idea of how much warmer, I mean, a few degrees centigrade global change doesn't sound like so much. Let me point out that a 1 degree temperature change, in this case decrease following a massive volcanic explosion, is enough to produce widespread suffering and famine worldwide, as happened following the Tambora explosion, volcanic explosion in 1815, and other cases which are still more serious. Several degrees is a very major temperature increase. And some of these predictions prognosticate that the American Midwest will be converted into something approaching scrub desert by the second half of the 21st century, and likewise the Soviet Ukraine and so on. But the American Midwest is the breadbasket of the world. If the grain and cereal foodstuffs from those places are unavailable, we are in serious trouble. In addition, through the volume expansion of seawater, the melting of glacial and polar ice, sea levels rise. And again, there's an uncertainty. Average prediction for the middle of the next century is 1 meter, 3 feet, but it might be as little as 1, and it might be as much as many meters. And then take a look at all the low-lying coastlines all around the world and ask what happens when the sea level rises. Okay, the Dutch, they're very good at building dikes and levees. They'll build more dikes and levees. That's not going to destroy Holland. But take a look at Bangladesh, where a 1 to 3 meter temperature rise will flood an area which is inhabited by tens of millions of people. Where are those guys going to go? Environmental refugees. It's a new prospect. For these reasons, I take very seriously the prediction of greenhouse warming. Now, there are policy makers who would like to respond as follows, and you have perhaps seen this sort of opinion in the pages of, naturally, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. That's the first place to expect a complaint about having to change anything. It's too uncertain, they say. This is serious stuff. There are a few scientists with computer models, and who can be sure that they know what they're talking about? And you want us to turn everything upside down because some scientists say that things are going to get a few degrees warmer? It's a few degrees warmer on the stage than it is in the audience. You don't see any catastrophe up here, do you? I'd like to pose the following question. Imagine this kind of thinking back in the height of the Cold War. You know, the United States, so let me ask a question. How much money do you think the United States has spent since 1945 on the Cold War? Sometimes I ask this question and From the back of the audience comes an answer, billions and billions. A huge underestimate, billions and billions. The amount of money that the United States has spent on the Cold War since 1945 is approximately $10 trillion. Trillion, that's the big one, with the T. What could you buy for $10 trillion? The answer is, you could buy everything in the United States except the land. Everything. Every building, truck, bus, car, boat, plane, pencil, baby's diaper. Everything in the United States except the land. That's what we've spent on the Cold War. So now let me ask, how certain was it that the Russians were going to invade? Was it 100% certain? Guess not, since they never invaded. What if it was only, let's say, 10% certain? What would advocates of big military buildup have said? They would have said, we must be prudent. It's not enough to count on only the most likely circumstance. If the worst happens, and it's really extremely dangerous for us, we have to prepare for that. Remote contingencies, if they're serious enough, have to be prepared for. It's classic military thinking. You prepare for the worst case. And so now I ask my friends who were comfortable with that argument, including the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, why doesn't that same argument apply to global warming? You don't think it's 100% likely? Fine, you're entitled to think that. If it's only a small probability of it happening, since the consequences are so serious, don't you have to make some serious investment to prevent it or mitigate it? I think there's a double standard of argument working, and I don't think we should permit it. Now, let me indicate, what is it you would do if you took greenhouse warming seriously? And what I'm going to try to argue is that virtually every one of the things that you would do to ameliorate greenhouse warming make sense on completely separate grounds. They are worth doing apart from greenhouse warming. Unlike the defense buildup, which made no sense whatever, except if you were confident that there was a real danger of Soviet troops pouring across the Elbe. There was no other mitigating circumstance. It's the least efficient way to spend money if you want to pump the national economy. It drew all sorts of scientific as well as fiscal resources out of the civilian economy. It is largely responsible for the economic chaos of the United States. Whereas, I will argue, spending money on mitigating greenhouse warming makes an enormous amount of sense for other reasons.